Mr. Lamy, you talk about the 1985, you were serving as the G7 Sherpa, and also now, later you serve as the Trade Commissioner for Brussels, and later, of course, Director General of the World Trade Organization. Is there any time during the past decades you served in international frameworks that can be compared to what we are experiencing right now? If not even, is there something at least we can borrow and inspire us at least to find some solutions?
Well, to the first part of your question, the answer is clearly no. Whether it's 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US, whether it's the 2008 crisis, which started on the financial system in the US and then expanded to the rest of the planet, which was a big economic shock. But this time is probably 5 to 10 times a bigger shock because all countries had to react to the pandemic in closing a lot of things, lockdowns, confinement, and this, of course, has had a major impact on economic systems. The level of international cooperation is extremely low. This is extremely worrying for the future, given that this world will be more difficult, and that issues, for instance, like climate change, which remain the big issue for the future, will be more difficult to address with a world which is more divided between China and US and more divided between rich countries and, on the other side, poorer countries who do not have the financial resources to cope with the crisis.
Tell me, at this point, against the backdrop of an early resigning Director General of Geopolitics and of a pandemic and of international organizations now being challenged for right or wrong, what does it mean for the qualities of a future Director General?
Well, first, I agree with you. The World Trade Organization is weaker than it was in the past. And this is a negative development, which is largely due to the US-China rivalry and to the difficulties of organizing trade-wise, investment-wise, a proper coexistence between a global liberal market capitalist system and the Chinese system, which is different. Now, to answer your precise question about the job description of the next WTO Director General, I think if I was a headhunter, I would give the priority to a politically experienced person to talk both to Mr. Trump or his successor and to Mr. Xi Jinping or to the European Trade Commissioner. So you need somebody with political clout, weight. You also need diplomatic skills, somebody that can broker a deal in different circumstances, understanding what both sides have in mind and trying to put something of a compromise on the table. And then you have to be somebody who can learn fast about the intricacies of anti-dumping procedures and sanitary and phytosanitary measures and regulation of telecoms, insurance, and so on.
If you were sitting in that chair of Director General, what would you do? How would you prioritize? What do you think are the tasks that should be prioritized given the mounting challenges that we're having today?
I think I would try to deploy a sort of time-bound agenda. Short-term, contain the trade distortions that the COVID crisis has created. The COVID crisis will have de-leveled the world level playing field. It has to be re-leveled. It will take time. This is priority number one, including, by the way, avoiding export restrictions on food, because in some poor developed countries on this planet,
Yes.
it unfortunately is likely that famine, hunger, will kill more people than the virus. The big geostrategic issue is to try and have US and China nearer each other in the understanding of how a fair, proper, open trade system works. A major strategy, which is basically keeping the US within the tent of the WTO and bringing China more into the tent, as it has to be considered now not as a poor developing countries, but as a major player. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, we will have to, and they will have to cope with what I call precautionism as opposed to protectionism. Protectionism is protecting your producers from foreign competition. That's a sort of easy thing to do, at least in the understanding. Precautionism is protecting your people from risk, and this, following the COVID crisis, this risk management, this more precautions in regulatory system will raise, and the problem being that countries do it very differently. Right. So the rise of precautionism, health, safety, security, and so on, will scatter more the level playing field, and this will need to be addressed. If all countries have different pesticide residues on flowers which they administer at their border, this is very bad news for flower producers, and a lot of them are in poor countries.
It's been a while that we haven't really heard a real plan, sir. When it comes to crucial international issues, what we have in our ears, in our eyes, are mainly rhetorical fights that do not solve any problem. And probably that's also a thing that the WHO have to face with the new Director General coming into the office. What would that mean? How were you trying to handle things like that when you were in the office for more than 10 years?
Yeah, but when I was in office, the world was a more peaceful place. It was less divided. It was a time where lots of people thought that at the end of the day, US, Europe, China, Latin America, later Africa would converge towards some sort of liberal, social, market, globalized capitalism. Today, you have the background of an intensifying US-China rivalry, and you have in the middle a group of countries led by the European Union, which is the only other big economic elephant in the world economy. So my answer to your question is there is a necessity for actors beyond US and China to mobilize, to recreate some sort of sense of convergence, and this necessitates a stronger European Union to tone down, calm, de-escalate, in a way, recouple US and China.
Post-COVID-19, how will trade change? How will global supply chain change? What are their impacts on the world order today? I asked those questions as well to Mr. Lamy. Let me ask you another specific question, which is about the global supply chain. You have heard from certain politicians in certain countries shouting about the decoupling. You have also seen, rhetorical fights in the media and the media hype about global supply chains dramatically moving to different places. Do you see from a trade expert's perspective that is really happening? Or it's merely a mirage somebody tried to paint To what degree do you think, sir, given the current observation and the degree of the crisis we're facing right now, that is likely to change, I mean, the global supply chain?
It's neither a change of paradigm, it's not deglobalization on the one side, and on the other side, nor is it what you call a mirage. It's somewhere in between. Mm-hmm. But roughly, my answer to what I understand of your question, which is that this reshoring, total revamping of globalization understood as the multi-localization of production systems of goods and services under the pattern of global supply chains, there is more bark than bite. You're absolutely right. There is a lot of bark and a lot of political discourse. And the reason for that is that in some cases, in case of urgency, and notably for the provision of essential drugs or medical equipment systems, some of these supply chains have broken for logistical reasons or for political reasons. And this has appeared as a big weakness for many countries. And it is true that some of these supply chains are too fragile and have to be made more resilient, more solid. Whatever way you do that, and there are many ways to do that, including, for instance, reinstalling inventories and stocks which were missing because of the just-in-time nature of global market capitalism efficiency. After all, I remember in the 70s when we had a big oil crisis, the consequence of that was that every country on this planet agreed that we all should have 90 days of oil reserve in case there is an oil shock. Mm-hmm. We did not have that for masks. We did not have this for personal protective equipment. We did not have that for some essential drugs. So there will be a bit of that. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, I do not believe that it is a change of paradigm, and those who dream of a sort of reshoring of these supply chains, i.e. renationalizing production systems which have been globalized, I don't think this will happen. And the reason why I don't think it will happen is very simple. It would be incredibly costly. The reason why these supply chains were organized the way they have been organized is that it is more efficient. It is less costly. At the end of the day, it is good for the price which the consumer pays for a good and a service. Globalization was efficient and painful, and deglobalization would be inefficient and painful. Although obstacles to trade and to investment during the next 5 years will be higher than they used to be before the COVID crisis.
So tell me about your reactions to the huge stimulus packages you have seen governments around the world have been using now to revive their economy, to make sure jobs will not be lost in such a dramatic way. Are they the way to go from trade perspective?
Such huge, massive public finance program stepping in a market capitalist system will be and are absolutely necessary.
But Mr. Lamy, is this an issue of priority that we're talking about, or is this an issue of a dramatic change of nature in the world rule and order that we're talking about?
Public authorities whose basic duty is to ensure the safety and the security of their population have had to step in massively. Politically, people believe that it is their national system that is in charge of protecting them. In terms of fear, of panic, of nightmares. People trust what is near to them. So inevitably, this has triggered a national reaction, a domestic reaction, not properly coordinated internationally, and this leads to a more heterogeneous, a more fragmented world, economic-wise and trade-wise, and it will take time to go back to a normally level playing field, which is what an international rules-based trade system is about. So brace for a few years of trade friction on top of the US-China rivalry, which, as we know, has been trade-wise weaponized on the US side, which existed pre-COVID crisis, and which is as worrying now as it was before, maybe even a bit more. If you look at what the US president says, for instance, about the delisting of Chinese companies who are rated on the New York Stock Exchange, which is a trade measure, but which is exercised as a weapon against China.
So, Mr. Lamy, are we seeing a collapse of the belief of, let's just say, fairness and internationalized the world at this moment, led by the biggest economy in the world? Or are we seeing the beginning of a huge change, which is about the economies that are looking at the principles as crucial, be able to rally themselves together and make something out of the current chaos?
This world is more divided. Now, does this change, A, the major challenges we have to cope with? No. And on top of that, we know that we now have to be much more bold in organizing a global public good, which is called health and pandemic prevention.
Yes.
The reality being that we were not properly prepared or organized, both at the national level and at the international level, on an issue which inevitably is global. There is a big gap between the lower capacity to address the problems internationally through international cooperation and the magnitude of the challenges. We will need to shrink this distance between the problems and our capacity to address them. We need a sort of regeneration of the multilateral system.